Wake up. It's the Sleep Unplugged podcast, episode 58, Lucid Dreaming. You make my dreams. Welcome, everyone, to the Sleep Unplugged podcast. My name is Dr. Chris Winter. I'm a neurologist and sleep specialist and your host for this fun episode of the podcast. If you're new to the Sleep Unplugged family, welcome. If you're a veteran of the podcast, welcome back. This should be, like I said, a lot of fun. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can do that through our social media, Twitter, Instagram, Threads. That is Dr. Chris Winter. You can find us on TikTok. You can also find the Sleep Unplugged page on YouTube, where we post all the videos of our episodes, and you can interact with the show in that way if you like. The podcast continues to be a huge success because of you. We really appreciate every listen, every subscription, every follow, every review. It really, really matters to us. And over the last couple of weeks, the podcast has really, really boomed. We've done some really cool episodes. Last week's Sleep and Yoga was a lot of fun. The one before that, Sexsomnia, a lot of fun. If you're a listener of the podcast, you know the first episode of every month is an episode about insomnia. And we still have one more week before that because of the way July falls. So I was looking for an interesting topic that we could talk about today. And I thought lucid dreaming would be a great one. I've gotten lots of comments and questions about lucid dreaming over the last year as something that people want to explore. And I think this is a great time to do it. It also really ties into last week's episode on sleep and yoga, because lucid dreaming and sort of corollaries are very central to the Hindu practices of yoga nidra, which we talked a little bit about in last week's episode, as well as the Tibetan Buddhist practice of yoga sleep. So it's a nice continuation of some of the themes we talked about last week. Before we get going, we always answer a question, comment, criticism at the top of the show. And this is from John Williams. I don't think it's John Williams, the 91-year-old composer of the Raiders of the Ark theme, Star Wars, what else is he? Superman. I actually saw him at Tanglewood last year. It's a big outdoor concert venue in the Northeast, and he was amazing. And I just saw the new Indiana Jones movie, and the live orchestral music that goes along with it really makes the movie. In fact, when I walked out of it, I was like, that's a pretty good movie. It was entertaining. We saw it up in New York when we were there. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought the music is really what's special about that movie to some extent. And he's great. So, but I don't think this is the same John Williams. But this John Williams, who's no less of value and worth in the eyes of the Sleep Unplugged podcast, asked, can you dream in light sleep on a night when I'm having trouble falling asleep or having restless sleep, just kind of tossing and turning? I feel like I'm awake, but then I'm dreaming a little bit, and then I'm back to being awake. So what John is really saying is he's kind of in between wakefulness and sleep and is kind of aware of that. And we touched upon issues related to that in our paradoxical insomnia episode. That was episode 20. We also talked a little bit about that last week in the episode about sleep and yoga, that yoga nidra really explores that space between consciousness and sleep, that transitional period, which for a lot of people is often misinterpreted as being awake. You know, somebody says, I get in bed, it takes me 8 hours every night to fall asleep. I'm lucky if I get 1 hour. My guess is during that 8 hours, there is sleep happening. So the simple answer to this question is yes, you can dream outside of stages of sleep that we typically think of as being related to dreaming, which is REM sleep. And we're going to talk a lot about that today with our topic of lucid dreaming. There are ways to dream in stages outside of REM sleep, light sleep, and deep sleep. These dreams tend to be a little bit different, less story-oriented, sometimes more easily forgotten. They can involve more feelings versus some sort of narrative. But the simple answer is yes, John, you can dream. And this also touches upon the idea of hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucinations, which we've talked about in our episode about narcolepsy. These are sort of hallucinatory, dreamlike phenomena that people have as they're going to bed or as they wake up that they can sometimes misperceive as being reality. You run into a friend and you said, "Hey, I really appreciate you letting me use that sweater for that party I've got going, coming up. Mind if I stop by and pick that up?" And your friend's like, "We've never had this conversation. You can borrow the sweater, but you and I have never talked about this." A very common one is somebody wakes up, they start to get dressed and ready for the day, and then they wake up and realize they were just kind of dreaming, hallucinating that they were getting ready for work. They're actually late for work at this point. So lots of interesting phenomenon there that we will get into when we get into the meat and potatoes of the show. Very quickly before we jump into that, the title of the song "You Make My Dreams" is obviously the Hall & Oates mega smash from, I believe, 81, 81. I think it was 81 actually, which is "You Make My Dream." Everybody thinks the song is "You Make My Dreams Come True." It's actually "You Make My Dreams." That's the title of the song. Sometimes "come true" is put in parentheses. This was a big hit for Hall & Oates. Hall & Oates had not really at that point had a big hit. This was off their 9th album. So their biggest hit up into that point was off their 5th album, Bigger Than Both of Us, which came out in 77, which had "Rich Girl" on it. And then disco happened, and they really struggled to get any kind of airplay. And so they made their 6th album, 7th album, 8th album, nothing really was coming of it. And before their 9th album, they said, "We need to make 2 big decisions here." Big decision number 1 that they made, which was very important, was when they moved back to New York. And they said, "We're going to get back to New York, get back to our roots, to that sound." They decided to record in Electric Lady Studio in Greenwich Village, which was famous for obviously Jimi Hendrix, and David Bowie recorded Fame there with John Lennon. I mean, huge place. And they also said, "We're going to pick up G.E. Smith and T-Bone Wolk, who were actually the Saturday Night Live house band for a while, and kind of get that, instead of session players, they wanted their own band that they would, rehearse with all the time." And they started writing songs with Sarah Allen, who was Daryl Hall's girlfriend, and her sister, Jana Allen. And they wrote the songs for this 9th album. "You Make My Dream" was a big one, and "Kiss on My List" were the 2 mega smashes. And after that, it was just one hit after another. So great song. We'll add it to the playlist. Really could have gone a lot of ways with "Dreaming" for sure, but I wanted to get Hall & Oates on the Sleep Unplugged playlist. And if you're on Spotify, look up Sleep Unplugged Playlist Volume 1. That's all the music from last season. And we've already released Volume 2, where we're adding songs to the upcoming. So you can find those on there and subscribe to that playlist. So lucid dreaming. What is lucid dreaming? Why do we care? Lucid dreaming is often defined as a dream in which the dreamer has a sense of awareness of the dream. And it's obviously been around probably since people dreamt. It was first described by Aristotle somewhere in the 4th century in his treatise On Dreams, from Parva Naturale, in which he stated, "Often when one is asleep, there is something in consciousness which declares that when then presence itself is but a dream." So this has been talked about. It was not really named lucid dreaming until the early 1900s, when Frederick van Eden, a Dutch psychologist, wrote about it in his book called A Study of Dreams. And even though he coined the phrase, sort of people who study this or in that space have said, yeah, he coined it, but what he was talking about was a little bit more specific than what we typically refer to as lucid dreaming today. So he felt like lucid dreams were sort of part of a bigger catalog of other kinds of dreams that can occur. So he coined or sort of termed 7 different kinds of dreams, which I find fascinating. There was initial dreams, so dreams that you would have right when you fell asleep or right when you nodded off when you were taking a nap. There were pathological dreams, ordinary dreams, vivid dreams, demonical dreams, general dream sensations, and then lucid dreaming. And he felt that lucid dreaming was the one of those 7, which really seemed to have the potential for really interesting application in future study. Later on, German psychologist Paul Thoele tried to sort of create criteria for what was a lucid dream. And he had 7 criteria that he sort of laid out. And these have been debated as well, too. The first was that the dreamer has awareness of the dream state. And I think that when you look across the board at lucid dreaming, that's pretty standard. That there's awareness of the capacity to make decisions. And to me, I understand what he's saying about that, too, in the sense that once you get into the lucid dreaming and you realize you're in the dream, to some extent, you realize you have at least some control either of the perception or of the decisions being made. A lot of people sort of differentiate lucid dreaming, I'm aware I'm dreaming, from what we call sometimes dream control, meaning, oh, I'm dreaming, so I can walk over there instead of being sort of a passive observer to this narrative that's playing out in the dream. Awareness of memory functions, so you can sort of tap into your experiences. Awareness of the dream environment, that you know you're in a dream environment, awareness of the meaning of dream, this is very debated, and awareness of concentration and focus, kind of debated as well. Deidre Barrett, who is an American psychologist, sort of came up with 4 corollaries of lucid dreaming. The dreamer is aware that they are dreaming. They are aware actions will not carry over after awaking. Physical laws need not apply in the dreams, and we'll touch on that a little bit later in terms of ways we enter into lucid dreaming. And the dreamer has a clear memory of the waking world. So you're accessing both the world you're in, the dream world, but you also have access of the waking world and the memories that go along with that as well, too. So really fascinating things. But at the core, what we're talking about is a sense of awareness. And how many times have you awakened from a dream and thought, okay, I was flying around and I had bird feathers coming out of my hands, but you didn't question the dream. Like that was when you woke up, you're like, well, that's crazy. Of course I don't have bird. Why did I not think that that was a dream when I was flying around my neighborhood with, bird feathers looking like Moira shit, coming, from the the croning is popping into my mind for whatever reason. So really interesting ideas about what creates a lucid dream and what does not. And the research on lucid dreaming is just other level when you start looking at some of the things that were being done. So we've talked about Bill Dement, who I consider to be the godfather of sleep in this country. Stanford professor, wrote the book. Blinking on the name of his book. It'll come to me in a minute. But he wrote a fantastic book about sleep. And he did some really interesting research on dreaming and lucid dreaming in terms of ways to communicate or indicate to the outside world that the dreamer was dreaming. So what would happen is, when the lucid dreamer would be hooked up for the sleep study, the observer would have, the individual would have electrodes on their head, and the observer, the scientist, was looking for eye movement signals. So Bill Dement came up with this idea of hooking individuals up to the EOG. It's like a EEG lead, but it's, next to your eye. So any eye movements, up, down, side to side, create little movements on the electrode that you're being monitored. And so the indication was, hey, when you're asleep and you start to lucid dream, I need you to look left and then right and then left and then right as soon as you can. And we'll know when we see that you're in the lucid dream. So imagine, I think this is so cool. You're the scientist, and I've run a million sleep studies over the years. The Promise of Sleep. That's Bill Dement's fantastic book, The Promise of Sleep. So you're running the thing. You're sitting there looking at this time, the paper running across the polysomnographic device and the little needles with the ink and the moving up and down. And you've got your subject in there, and she's gone to sleep. And they're sleeping, and all of a sudden, as you're monitoring the pins and needles, and you see the brain activity is clearly asleep. This person is not conscious. In fact, they're probably in REM sleep. You see the little sawtooth waves and all the things that we know that indicate an individual is not conscious and in REM sleep. And suddenly, zip, zap, zip, zap, you see the eye movement pins indicate a leftward movement, then a rightward movement, then a leftward, and then a rightward, and then no more. And you're like, oh my God, this person who is asleep is communicating with me. I mean, I just think that is absolutely the best thing in the world. So there was all these really cool experiments kind of set out to look at that. And another one of my favorites was Stephen LeBerg, who's also at Stanford at the time, was doing studies about time perception within dreams. So you've had a dream, I'm sure most people who are listening to this have had a dream where maybe a lot of things happen in a relatively short period of time, or perhaps the opposite. So there's a sense of time distortion. I was out mowing a lawn or whatever, but I fell asleep and woke up, and it seems like the time that was happening in the dream was very different than the time that I fell asleep, because I'm still, the TV show I started is only 7 minutes in, and I've awakened. So I remember the credits starting, and now I've awakened up. So I was asleep for no more than 6 minutes. It seemed like what happened in my dream lasted longer than 6 minutes. So he was doing experiments where the lucid dreamer, once lucid, would indicate with like an eye movement and then count 10 seconds, 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. And when he got to 10, left, right, eye movement. So it was possible for LeBerg to measure time in the dream compared to real time. And he actually found that the times were relatively consistent. And this was confirmed by other researchers in Germany and whatnot. So fascinating, trying to figure out what is dream time and how does it relate to real time. So another fantastic one that you have to look up if you have access to some research. 2021 study entitled Real-Time Dialogue Between Experimenters and Dreamers During REM Sleep. And to me, this is just so you're trying to figure out ways in which the dreamer and the researcher can actually communicate with one another through breathing, eye movements. It's almost like an entire language. If you remember the book, The Butterfly and the Diving Bell, where the writer, he was like a French writer, I believe, literally transcribed an entire novel, even though he was locked in from a stroke, because he had the ability to blink his eyes. So he couldn't do anything. His motor functions were all gone, but he was cognitively intact. He was just locked in, is what we call it. It's a terrible situation that happens with a particular kind of stroke. And so you're kind of working within those kinds of constructs. How can we communicate with the dreamer through very limited, abilities? It's like The Martian with Matt Damon. They had this whole elaborate communication system through this little thing he had set up that the satellite could see. And so anyway, so it's that kind of thing. So how do we do it? Chris, you've sold me. I'm ready to start lucid dreaming. I really want to know more about it. Well, the lucid dreaming is all about what we call the induction, getting into the lucid dream. And there's been lots of different mechanisms proposed over the years. And I'll go through a few of them here and talk a little bit about them. So a lot of them are cognitive techniques. So one is a mnemonic. It's often called the MILD technique. That's an acronym, MILD. So that requires the dreamer to wake up in the middle of the night, imagine a previous dream, convince themselves to remember the dream signs, and then go back to sleep again. So every time you wake up, and how many times do people do that? A lot. We talked about it. We have a whole show about what you do if you wake up in the middle of the night. So that becomes part of the induction. You wake up, you imagine what you were dreaming about previously, convince yourself to remember those signs of that dream. And then when you go back to sleep again, if you enter back into that dream, you're kind of looking for it again. Probably the most commonly used method is the reality test, which there's a lot of variations on that as well too, but it all points to an individual confirming or questioning reality frequently throughout the day. So I did some experiments with lucid dreaming. I'll talk a little bit about it in a little bit. And this was the induction method that I use. So what I would do is I would take off my wedding ring and I would look at it in my hand. And it's important to look at hands are really interesting when it comes to lucid dreaming, because if you look at your hands during a dream, they're often quite distorted. So I would take my ring off of my finger, I would turn it 180 degrees, and I would observe that, I'm pushing on the ring. It's not bending. Of course, this one's bending because it's a latex one or a rubber one. I would look at my hands, 5 fingers. They look like they're interacting with the ring properly. And then I would put it back on my finger, and I would evaluate that experience in my mind as being real. Okay, I think that I, in reality, am taking my ring off, flipping it 180 and putting it back on. My hands look right. Some people do a test where they poke one hand with the pointer finger of the other, because often in dreaming, your hand will go through the other hand. Your hand will poke through your hand. So my finger is not poking through my hand. My ring looks pretty. This is real. I'm not dreaming this. I am recording this podcast right now. I don't believe that I'm dreaming that I'm recording this podcast. So when you do all these types of things, you start creating a habit of checking reality. And it's really easy. Driving down the road, pull your ring off, take a look at it, stick it back on your finger. As I'm talking to a patient, it's almost like a little nervous thing that somebody might do. Nobody's going to question it, but all the time you're doing it. Well, what happens is you will start to bring that reality check or that reality test into your dream. So I started doing this many years ago, and I've had a couple sporadic lucid dreams. I would say within 2 to 3 weeks of doing this, I started having much more lucid dreams, many more lucid dreams. And what was interesting was I would notice that I would, fall asleep. I would, be in the dream, and I would check like, wait a minute. I've got feathers and something's going on. This is not real. And I would get so excited that I figured out that I was dreaming that I would often wake up. So I found it to almost be in 2 parts. There was the reality check, which did a very good job and a very quick job of allowing me to recognize lucidity. But then I had to be calm about it. Like, okay, when you think about REM sleep versus deep sleep, it's kind of fragile. So that state of being in REM sleep or dreaming is not terribly different from wake in a lot of ways. So I often, and I think you've probably experienced that too. And it was almost like John Williams's question. I'm in this light sleep and I'm kind of dreaming, but I think I'm aware. Like there's a certain sense of lucidity to that too. So what you've got to do is sort of be ready for it. Okay, wow, my finger just passed through my hand. This is a little strange here. I'm definitely dreaming. So I'm just going to kind of go with it, stay in this dream. And now I'm going to start to try to do things. And the great things you can do when you lucid dream, and this was what I was really interested in, was number one, look at your hands. Putting your hands in front of your face during lucid dream. Often our brains don't render our hands particularly well. So all of a sudden you've got these 2, massive fingers or 20 fingers on each hand or something like that. In fact, I read somewhere that you can find an AI picture. There's some AI influencer that's been very popular now. She's, 28-year-old attractive person, but she's not real. She's an AI generated person. So the picture of this woman with Elon Musk is totally fabricated. And somebody said, you can tell because just look at her hands. They don't look quite right. AI doesn't do a great job with hands. Well, neither does your brain. The other things you can do when you're lucid dreaming is look at your feet. They don't tend to touch the ground particularly well, or look up. Dreams tend to be dark. And even when you're inside looking up, you often look up at a night sky. Well, my holy grail of lucid dreaming experimentation was somebody said, go find a mirror and look at yourself in the mirror. It will be quite a show. So I'll tell you a quick story about my best lucid dreaming experience. I fell asleep. I was driving to a circus. So, when you go to the big top, I was parking in a field, and my son's little league baseball coach was directing me where to park. And I was like, I don't think this is real. And suddenly I realized, oh yeah, this is totally a dream. Kept myself together, didn't freak out and fall out of the dream, and immediately got out of the car, parked, and went to the tent. And, in the meantime, look down at my feet. Yeah, just not, doesn't look right. And then suddenly was inside the big top tent. And I was like, I've got to find a mirror. Well, where do you find a mirror in a public facility? A bathroom. So I start to walk into the bathroom and somebody says, whoa, 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 this is the ladies' room, sir. You're walking into the wrong bathroom. And like an idiot, I left. So I love the idea that that Barrett was talking about, which was you've got physical laws need not apply in the dream. You're aware that the actions will not carry over into awakening. So even though I knew it was a lucid dream, I was still nervous about walking into a ladies' room and getting in trouble, or even though I knew. So that lucidity is kind of fleeting and not totally. Like I was still I knew I was in a lucid dream, trying to find a mirror to look at my face, but I was still respecting laws of reality and not wanting to offend the sensibilities of some young woman in a bathroom at a circus. So fantastic. So long story short, I left the bathroom and could never find the men's room before I woke up. But anyway, a lot of fun with it, and really interesting stuff. So other ways you can get into it, diaries can sometimes be helpful, dream diaries, and then a lot of sensory kind of cues, smells, tactile types of things, auditory cues. So playing certain notes and smelling, lavender before you go to bed. There's certain things you can do that kind of help you sort of induce the lucid dreaming. There's also medication substances that have been looked at that have not been particularly useful, and then sort of current or using electrical stimulation of the brain to induce it, which is not particularly practical or helpful. So why do we care? Why does it even matter? Why do we want to lucid dream? And we talked about this a little bit in episode 51 when I was looking at some of the research that came out of the Indianapolis 2023 sleep meeting. There was a high schooler who was looking at lucid dreaming as a treatment for nightmare disorder. So nightmare disorder. So everybody has bad dreams. Nightmare disorder is when you're having so many nightmares that it becomes sort of a problem. And so she was looking at using lucid dream techniques to help an individual exit from that. So if every night you go to bed and dream your car crashes through a guardrail and goes over a cliff and you die, that creates a certain level of stress. Like I like my dreams. They're generally fairly benign, or they're exciting or fun, or so to fear them is really pretty miserable. And so can you imagine every night you dream you die in a car fireball crashing down the side of that would not make you excited to move towards sleep. And we've talked a lot about how anxiety and sleep really work negatively with one another. So this high schooler was basically saying, look, let's help individuals use lucidity to help change the nature of the dream. So if you can become aware of your situation in the dream, then you slow down, or you take another road that doesn't drive by the cliff. Or if you're really creative, as you go crashing through the guardrail, little electronic, wings shoot out of the side of the plane, a little engine pops up like in some sort of Mission Impossible movie, and you fly around in your car that can convert into a secret spy airplane, whatever you want the thing to be. Or you jump out of the car and you have a parachute on your back and you land gently in a grassy field. Like you can make it what you want to be. And people have done this with PTSD for a long time, sort of visualizations and rehearsing right before you go to bed. In fact, my wife just sent me a little link about, hey, the 5 minutes before you go to bed is a really important time because you can sort of preload what you're thinking and your emotions right before you go to bed. And often that might influence how you think or dream. I mean, if you're really stressed about work right before you go to bed, you're probably going to dream about work. In fact, I used to tell my kids when they were little, hey, got any tests this week? Yeah, I'm studying. I got to learn all the amendments of the Constitution by Friday. Okay, well, listen, before you go to bed, that's the last thing I want you to read about. You don't have to memorize them. Just read through all of them and then immediately go to bed, because I had this belief that your mind will actually work on those things while you're sleeping. And my middle son just told me he still does that to this day, because he definitely believes it. He's like, I don't really know them, I read them, I go to bed. When I wake up, I seem to know it better. And Matthew Walker did a lot of really interesting research about how sleep helps to consolidate memory, which is why it's a terrible idea to pull an all-nighter right before your art history exam. So outside of nightmare disorder, as our lovely high school student was researching from episode 51, what else can we get from it? There was a great study in 2020 called Lucid Dreaming and the Feeling of Being Refreshed in the Morning, a diary study. So this study basically said people who had lucid dreams tended to feel more refreshed the next day, which is really interesting to me and a little bit contrary to what I would have guessed, because I've talked to people who have said things like, my lucid dream is helping people move furniture. I'm always helping people do things. And when I dream that I'm doing something physical, like moving furniture, I actually feel tired from it the next day. So there's almost a sense of, if you're working hard in the dream, you tend to feel it the next day to some extent. But this study basically said, no, people who were more practiced at lucid dreaming seem to feel more refreshed from it the next day. And again, sure, if you're having dreams where you're crashing your car through a guardrail into a fireball down the side of a mountain, maybe altering that to something more peaceful could have some sort of carryover in terms of the next day. My middle son was a swimmer all through high school and part of college. And I remember one of his swim coaches said, oh, I'm a big time lucid dreamer. And when you're a sleep specialist, people tell you all kinds of good stuff. And he said to me one time, we were at a swim meet and we were sitting there talking, and he said, oh yeah, I'm a huge lucid dreamer. In fact, I get work done during my lucid dreams. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, like for instance, I coach summer league swim. And so when our team, Forest Lakes meets Boar's Head Inn, and we're going to have our big swim meet, I can set my lineups. Okay, I need 4 guys to swim the medley relay in the 11, 12-year-old age group, but we only have 3 right now because one kid's on vacation. So I'm going to bring an 8-year-old up to swim that leg because we just need to finish in the top 3. And I think that we can do, so when he woke up, all he needed to do was get a piece of paper and pencil out because he'd already worked everything out in his lucid dream, which I always thought was really fantastic. And he used alarms as an induction, meaning that he would set several alarms in the morning and would often have lucid dreams in between there. Another one is, and we've talked a little bit about this with sports, which is visualization of an activity can often improve it, meaning that you're a pitcher, you've had Tommy John surgery on your shoulder, you cannot throw a baseball. In fact, you can't even move your arm. So you're going to sit down with a mental skills coach and mentally pitch a game or pitch a few innings. So you're sitting there mentally visualizing yourself throwing baseballs at imaginary batters. Or I've never really seen this in action, but maybe you're sitting there with your mental skills coach and you're in a quiet room and your eyes are closed, and your mental skills coach goes, okay, well, stepping up to the bat now is Justin Turner, and you're going to pitch to him. And so you like to start him off with a fastball down and away. So I want you to do that. And the mental skills coach stops, and the pitcher sits there and mentally imagines himself in great detail throwing that fastball down and away. Okay, great. Justin did not swing at that. So it's 1 ball, no strikes. Now you're going to come back with a fastball right down the middle, just whatever you're doing. And so as you do that, there's a thought that individual, when they can start using their arm again, will be further along in the process than the person who didn't. That you can actually maintain a skill by visualizing it rather than simply going out and doing it. So there's a study in 2016 from the Journal of Sports Science that said effectiveness of motor practice in lucid dreams, a comparison with physical and mental practice. And it basically said, yeah, you can, in a lucid dream, practice a skill and to some degree make yourself better at it than others. We've talked about the NBA player shooting free throws prior to going to bed. Same thing. So I think there's a real practicality to lucid dreaming, particularly when you're dealing with something like a physical activity or a sport. There's been several studies in addition to our high schooler about the use of lucid dreaming in terms of treating recurrent nightmares or nightmare disorder. There was a 1997 study in psychotherapy and psychosomatics called Treatment of Recurrent Nightmare, another one in 2019, Frontiers of Psychology, My Dream, My Rules. Can lucid dreaming treat nightmares? So there is a body of evidence out there. And I would say if somebody said, look, Chris, what is the one thing lucid dreaming is probably best suited for? I think it's that. I think it's for individuals who are struggling with frequent nightmares, unpleasant dreams, unpleasant thoughts during the night. You can even throw PTSD in there. There was actually a study looking at veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder. This was from the 2021 journal Dreaming. It said lucid dreams in veterans with post-traumatic stress disorder, including nightmares. There was a sample of 54 veterans with PTSD, and lucid dreaming was, sort of associated with these individuals being able to manage it better, having lower anxiety levels because of it. The last two things I'll mention very quickly. One is narcolepsy. That there was a study from Sleep 2015, lucid dreaming and narcolepsy, that said 77.5% of narcolepsy patients have lucid dreaming versus fewer than 50% of controls, people who didn't have narcolepsy. And this definitely goes along with the hypnagogic, hypnopompic hallucinations and things we've talked about that go along with narcolepsy. These individuals often do have awareness of the fact that their dreams are happening and are not real. I didn't have that conversation. I didn't experience that type of thing. The other one that I wanted to mention, excuse me, was from Behavioral Sleep Medicine, Managing Insomnia Using Lucid Dreaming Training, a pilot study. This was an open label trial of 48 adults with insomnia disorder, and showed that they called it LDTI, which I love that. So it's not CBTI, which we've talked about, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, which is fantastic means to treating. This is lucid dreaming therapy for insomnia. LDTI showed that it may have a place in the treatment of insomnia, that those individuals who participated in LDTI showed significant reductions in insomnia, anxiety symptomatology, and depressive symptomatology, which I think is really fascinating and really interesting. So that's what I wanted to talk about. If somebody wants even more high-level expertise on lucid dreaming, I'm going to recommend an expert and a book that I really like. The expert is Kristen LaMarca. She's a PhD. She's also behavioral sleep medicine certified, and a really fantastic person and expert. You can find her at Lucid Dream Tips. And she wrote a book called Learn to Lucid Dream. I got to interview her one time for a little online show, and she is a wealth of highly reputable scientific knowledge about lucid dreaming. So check out her book, Learn to Lucid Dream. Follow her on Twitter. Again, Lucid Dream Tips. Her name is Kristen LaMarca. She's a great follow if you're interested in more high-level information. So that's it. I'm going to be looking out for all of your communications about your interesting experiences with lucid dreamings. I want to hear about them all. DM me, Dr. Chris Winter Twitter, Dr. Chris Winter Instagram, Dr. Chris Winter Threads, Dr. Chris Winter TikTok. Find us on the Sleep Unplugged YouTube channel. I've got two books, The Sleep Solution, Why Your Sleep is Broken, How to Fix It, which mentions lucid dreaming in a small amount, and then The Rested Child, Why You're Tired, Wired, or Irritable Child May Have a Sleep Disorder, and How to Help. Thanks for listening. Thanks for making this podcast so fantastic. Please like, subscribe. I love reviews. If you want to post them, they're great. And until next week, sleep well and dream well.